Ringabel is my favorite character in all of video games. And it's really funny saying that, because all I can hear in the back of my head are the confused grunts of people who don't really understand why I would say something like that. After all, Bravely Default isn't a franchise that people are singing the praises of, and Ringabel isn't some revolutionary character who changed video games as we know it. And from the outset, I should have hated him from the moment I was introduced to him, since in the beginning of the game, he comes off as some amnesiac chauvinistic pig who needed to put a sock in his mouth and a clamp on his dick. But not only did he immediately become my favorite character, but he only stole more and more of my heart the more that the web named Ringabel unraveled into something far more complicated than he originally seemed to be. Before we really get into the nitty-gritty, please note that I'm going to be referring to him as Ringabel for the entirety of this essay, because although he and Alternus were once one person, I believe that his life and legacy as Alternus died when Ringabel was born, and trying to see them as one would more or less shatter Ringabel's character. We good here? I think we're good. Alright, so today we're going to look into Ringabel throughout his tenure as a Warrior of Light to explore why he's not only my favorite Bravely character, but why he's my favorite character in video games. Let's turn Love's Vagrant up on high, because we're going to dive into the Child of Florum, Alternus Dim, or as we know and love him, Ringabel. Ringabel is introduced to us as a simple amnesiac living in Kaldisla, because he just sort of woke up there. They found him unconscious and without a single thought about who he was or where he was supposed to be. Since the Kaldislan people are so sweet, and the plot needs the four to meet, the amnesiac is given a place to live, clothing, and even a name, Ringabel. It could have been a cruel joke, since nothing rang a bell in his mind, or maybe there was some great reason never mentioned, but it's clear that Kaldisla is going to be his home, at least for a while. And it might have been his home forever, if not for one specific item that he was discovered with, Dee's journal. Now, the first time you're playing the game, the journal probably didn't mean diddly, since it talks about all of these journeys and these people, but until you've actually encountered these things, it doesn't actually hold any weight. But I'll be frank with you and admit that in my most recent playthrough of Bravely, I went through the entire journal and not only put together what happened in it, but became so overwhelmed with emotion that I cried a little over some of the content. To know and understand what happened was just a little too much for my weak soul, but we'll get back to that a little later. For now, the only thing to remember about Dee's journal is that Ringabel has it, and although he doesn't understand who wrote it or why he has it, it seems to tell the future about what'll happen to him and the other Warriors of Light, Tiz, Agnes, and Adia. And from the moment he stumbles onto Tiz and Agnes in Kaldisla, it becomes abundantly clear to him that he needs to join them on their journey. Agnes might protest, but there's simply no other option for him. He has sworn himself to their cause because his heart has been stolen by a promise that Dee's journal holds for him, the promise of Adia Lee and her heart. Idia is somebody that Ringabel has no memory of ever meeting or seeing in his life, but the seemingly prophetic journal has not only promised him that she'll be at his side, but it also speaks of their love, of a heart that beat only for Idia, something that Ringabel not only finds himself fascinated by, but longs for. His confidence is overflowing, because if this book speaks of the future, then they're destined to be together, and he couldn't dare to miss out on something like that. He may be a bit of a flirtatious swine, but whatever this journal is selling, Ringabel wants to buy in bulk, because he shoves himself into the party after making sure Tiz and Agnes understand that his book literally talks about the future, something neither could really pass up. Sure, it totally helps that his home was destroyed by Ominous Crow the night before, so he doesn't exactly have anywhere to go, but Ringabel was going to make sure he was on his way to Centro Keep, no matter what. However, even though he both gets the chance to meet Idia, and she does inevitably join the party, once again to Agnes's cries of "unacceptable!" This doesn't mean that she's going to fall in love with him or accept that they're supposedly meant to be together. quite the opposite in honesty, since Idia is almost immediately repulsed by him and his behavior. She wants nothing to do with him, be it romantic or otherwise. But since they're on the same team and soon enough sworn to Agnes's cause, they're stuck together and are simply going to have to learn to live and let be. Luckily for Ringabel's sake, he's about to prove that he's not some useless tool with only a journal that everybody actually needs to keep a leg up in this dog and pony show. After all, when faced with the battle against Arjun Heinkel of the Eternian Sky Knights, killing him might have been a good thing, but it left the four warriors in an airship, known as the Echelot, that was going to take them down with it if they didn't think of something quick. Although Idia is the Eternian and a former member of the Sky Knights, airships weren't quite in her jurisdiction, and with how sheltered both Tiz and Agnes have been, they're immediately out of the running as well. This leaves us with our amnesiac, who, although doubtful of himself initially, doesn't fail to almost immediately turn tail and prove himself by succeeding in flying them to safety. This elevates him to Airship Captain Ringabel, holder of the Prophetic Deeds Journal, and cementing his immediate use to the group. He might spout some annoying lines, he might try to get into Idia's pants quite a bit, and he may fuss way too much about his hair and clothing, but he's the only one capable of flight, and in a world where the woods are toxic and the water is rotted, that's more than a little necessary. Thus, Captain Ringabel is born, and he's responsible for getting the entire group to the Kingdom of Ansheim, so they can awaken their very first crystal and help Agnes to try and get the affairs of her home properly sorted out. Although I genuinely enjoy Ansheim as a place, there isn't much to say about Ringabel during this time, since it more or less is completely about Agnes cementing herself as a Vestal and as somebody to be both respected and listened to. Great arc, great chapter, but simply not for Ringabel. Sure, he gets to meet the Sage of Yoyana, aka Ringabel's initial hero in life and who he wants to grow up to be, but this doesn't develop him in any way, instead only reinforcing what we already know about him. Ringabel is obsessed with women, and most of the time he's thinking only with his dick, something that disgusts Agnes, angers Idia, and makes Tiz very, very embarrassed. He's been this way since the beginning, so we don't really need to worry about his character. He's just flirtatious, sex-motivated Ringabel. Right? Well, I think you can tell from his title of favorite that simply isn't the whole story. Not by a long shot. Because after we awaken the first crystal and all seems well for Ansheim, the game decides to ask us an important question. Is everybody trustworthy? When boarding the Echelot to begin the journey to Florum, home of the water crystal, Ringabel claims he's been struck with a bout of illness and needs to take a moment of leave, disappearing from the rest of the group and leaving them a little more vulnerable than before. Within minutes of his absence, the Echelot becomes host to another person, Dark Knight Alternus Dim, somebody that Idia has known since childhood and who simply isn't privy to the idea of her fighting for the Vestal instead of killing her and returning to her home. She's Eternian royalty after all. How can she betray her home and her people? Naturally, Idia doesn't take any of this lying down, and although Alternus doesn't attack her, instead taking out all of his anger on poor little Tiz, he does make it clear that he has no intentions of being so nice next time around, smashing the stone that enabled the Echelot to fly before vanishing, leaving the group without a way to fly to Florum, and in absolute awe of what just happened. And a few moments later, who shows up but a seemingly confused Ringabel, who is completely unaware of the situation. He claims to feel much better, but is more or less oblivious to everything that's happened, something that annoys Idia, although it doesn't arouse suspicion from her. It's not meant to, of course, but for the player, it's the first seed of doubt we're given, the first chance to close your 3DS and ask yourself, what are the odds that Ringabel isn't who he says he is, that he's Alternus Dim in disguise? And I totally did during my first playthrough, or rather, I remember shaking my 17-year-old head and mumbling something akin to, he couldn't be, because the idea of a character I enjoyed being a secret villain was just too horrible for me to want to see. Instead, I pushed the doubt away and continued to play, taking the group over to Florum to begin our search for Olivia and the eventual awakening of the water crystal. Florum is, of course, Ringabel's new favorite place, being that it is inhabited solely by women. But once again, the story simply has to be told, and the crystals and Agnes need to come first sometimes. Although this doesn't mean our blonde doesn't get his way sometimes, since he uses his journal to get Agnes to enter the Sacred Flower Festival and ultimately secures the item of Bravo Bikini for the group. That being said, however, the part of the Florum chapter of the game that sticks out to me the most isn't the actual arc of the chapter, but one of the asterisk side quests of this part of the game, that being the side quest of Fiore de Rosa. De Rosa is more or less what would have happened if Ringabel would have been just a little bit different. And the best part about him is that Bravely Default is so aware of this that it's the sole reason why De Rosa exists in the first place. In the beginning of this side quest, Ringabel takes note of this well-dressed man who seemingly has no problem getting a woman on his arm, giving our amnesiac a little bit of advice before returning to his own womanizing. He almost immediately becomes Ringabel's idol, somebody he's obsessed with understanding, just so he can have a chance at wooing women as he does, or perhaps even using those techniques to woo Idia once and for all. This obsession begins to take a toll on Ringabel, who is no longer sleeping during the night because he's obsessed with hunting down Fiore and watching him, to the point where he begins to wonder just how he's actually doing it. This obsession gets to the point where it bogs down the entire team, and Idia simply refuses to stand for it anymore, deciding that anything is worth ending the situation, even if it means allowing Fiore to flirt with her. So our Eternian Royal dons the famous Bravo Bikini and goes for it, not only catching the eye of Fiore, but finding herself under his spell before she even has time to celebrate a supposed job well done. It's a little too late, but Ringabel quickly realizes that something is very wrong, that Idia wouldn't have taken so long, and that he more or less put her into this incredibly dangerous situation, which he confronts quickly, by not only finding Fiore's hideout, but more or less losing his freaking mind on him. The thing that separates the two of them is their opinions on women, on the fact that Ringabel understands women as their own people with their own opinions and actions, whereas Fiore sees them as nothing but a means to an end, as something that can be exploited to ultimately gain both power and finances. After all, the women aren't infatuated with him of their own free will. They aren't falling for him because they desire him or because they choose to be with him, but because he's created a cologne to make them fall for him. And the reason Idia has been kidnapped is because he's creating more and more potent cologne, using the infatuated women that he brings back to his lair. Ultimately, you rescue Idia and beat the living shit out of Fiore, but it's clear that this left a lasting scar on Ringabel, who is clearly terrified by the chance that he lost Idia forever. But, of course, he can't help himself from making a stupid comment about her outfit, so he might be dead to Idia for a little while, but at least it's clear by the fact that he led the charge the entire way that he wasn't going to let anything happen to Idia if he could help it. So we take out the water boss and reawaken the water crystal, and things are good to go again. Time to head to Eisenberg to reawaken the fire crystal, because their Vestal is dead, and there's nothing we can do about that except awaken the crystal for her and keep on trucking. When it comes to the entire Heartschild storyline, unfortunately, Ringabel gets a bit of the shaft again, because the first half of the arc is focused primarily on Idia and her relationship with the Black Blades, mostly her previous master Kami Izumi, while the second half of the arc focuses on Tiz and his relationship with Egil, a little boy who unknowingly reawakens the regret and grief sleeping inside him regarding the death of his little brother Till. Although neither story particularly involves Ringabel personally, since without a past it's quite hard for people you once knew to get involved in your life, the game simply cannot resist posing a familiar question to us once more. The game takes time every once in a while to show us the Eternian Council of Six, since by this point we're quite familiar with three specific members, Victor, Victoria, and Alternus, along with constantly being reminded of the presence of Brave, the Eternian Grand Marshal and the father of Idia. During one of these flashbacks, Alternus dares to speak out against Victor and Victoria, and the childlike Arcanist doesn't exactly take kindly to his words, casting a spell on him that puts him through quite a lot of agony. He's not doing so hot, but ultimately is forced to shake it off and continue going, since he doesn't exactly have time to just lay in bed and recover. Cut back to Eisenberg the next morning, and Tiz seems to be concerned over the state of Ringabel, who he notes as having come to the inn really late last night and being in a lot of pain. Our blonde doesn't seem all too concerned, since he came home from a less than successful date, one that ended with him getting the crap kicked out of him for being incapable of keeping his mouth shut every once in a while. Naturally, Tiz doesn't question things, but once again, the audience is supposed to. This is the second time that Alternus and Ringabel are more than meets the eye, and the second time we're asked to question if everything is connected. If Ringabel snuck out of Heart's Child under the guise of going out on a date with who knew who, returned to Eternia, and ultimately was wounded by Victoria, before lugging himself back to Eisenberg, still with horrific wounds that he'd try and play off as his date being unable to stand him at all. Once again, 17-year-old me questioned him and shoved everything away. There was just no way they could be one and the same. Ringabel was different. He loved and trusted his friends, and he'd never break that trust. Would he? Well, for now, we're not meant to think about it too much. Not when we have other things to concern ourselves with, as we ultimately help the shield bearer secure victory over the Black Blades and reawaken the Fire Crystal. Egil is taken to go live in Kaldisla, and after bemoaning the fact that getting to Eternia in the Echelot simply isn't an option, our quartet turns the largest man-made island in the game, Grand Ship, into an airship, because why not? Ringabel, the airship pilot, returns to us, and now we have a way to actually reach Eternia without getting anybody brutally annihilated. So things are looking up for the group. I mean, hey, we're almost done. So the gang heads off to Eternia, which, shockingly, is devoted mostly to Idia, because I mean, she is kind of the point behind Eternia being a big deal. I mean, hell, she decides to stop the flow of white magic that is keeping her mother alive and healthy, simply because doing so means they can restore the Earth Crystal and help Agnes on her quest. The group is separated, Idia has to fight and defeat her father, and we awaken the Earth Crystal. Nothing is easy, but it's all hard-earned and ultimately necessary for the quest. With all 4 crystals awoken, Aerie tells the group the only thing left to do is reach the Pillar of Light, and everything will then go back to normal. The world will be restored and the Great Chasm will close. Or at least, this is what is promised to them, because we fought every Eternian character pose as a rival so far, but one of them has been suspiciously missing, and that would be our friendly neighborhood edgelord, Alternus Dim. While, surprise, surprise, it turns out that before Idia and the others kicked Brave's teeth in, he asked for a favor from Alternus, for him to go on ahead and keep the group from reaching the Pillar of Light, because the true monster wasn't Eternia or some kind of monster in the pillar, but aboard Grand Ship itself. So, hey, idiots like me who posed the question if Ringabel was a liar all along could finally breathe a sigh of relief, as Alternus stands as the last line of defense and begs for the group to understand that Aerie, their trusty little fairy pal who has been your companion and mentor this whole time, is actually the true antagonist and must be killed immediately. Unfortunately for Alternus, however, the Warriors of Light don't exactly take kindly to being told one of their own is actually a monster who needs to be slain. So they accuse him of standing in their way, trying to prevent progress, and being the true monster and engage him in battle. Fighting Alternus for the first time is kind of interesting, because oh my god, does this man pour his entire soul onto the floor during this fight. For Alternus, he understands that this might be his only chance to properly express himself, because this fight can only end one of 2 ways, in his defeat or the defeat of the warriors and probable slaying of Aerie. Either way, his odds of getting everything he wants just aren't plausible, and knowing this, our child plot dumps everything. Not only does he confess to Idia that he's madly in love with her, but that he's always been in love with her and has dreamed of marrying her someday, but that he's always felt betrayed by this world. Alternus was born in Florum, you know, that town that doesn't allow men to live in it, and was almost immediately abandoned by his mother. He spent his childhood begging for food, drinking out of puddles, and basically just trying to survive until Brave found him, scooped him up from the gutter, and turned him into the Alternus Dim we know today. And this whole broken nature kind of plays into his asterisk, doesn't it? After all, a Dark Knight not only inflicts pain on themselves, but grows stronger the lower their HP is and the more damage they take. For Alternus, he is a broken person who is ultimately a hard boss because of it. Somebody who only grows more fragmented the further you get into the fight and the longer you listen to his cries. Or don't listen, since you choose to protect Eri and beat him. When you land the finishing blow on him, the entire game decides to throw you for a loop, because during the fight, Alternus's trusty helmet is shattered, and for the first time ever, we're given the chance to see what he actually looks like under that thick black armor. And we're ultimately greeted with none other than the face of Ringabel. But with Ringabel standing right there, there is no way they can be one and the same. So what's going on here? Unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of knowing, as he falls to his death and the entire group is left with a simple question. Ringabel, what are you? This is a question even he cannot answer, because he's just as awestruck as the rest of them. Something that doesn't get better when the Pillar of Light gives Eri all the energy she needs, and the group is knocked out by the immense power of the situation, ultimately waking up back in Kaldisla, with the world none the wiser about what has transpired. All of the crystals are corrupted again, nobody remembers actually meeting the four, and it looks like everything either reset itself or is slightly different. The only thing that is familiar anymore are our protagonists, and even then some doubt has been sown into Tiz, Agnes, and Adia as they begin to wonder just how in the world Ringabel and Alternus can have the same face. Our blonde friend is beginning to be plagued by cripplingly painful headaches, becoming easily the most worn out of the four because of this. But for the entirety of the Second World, he is more or less incapable of explaining why the two share a face when they are clearly two different people. Suspicions are beginning to waft to the surface regarding both Ringabel and Eri, but it's not until the Third World where things actually begin to come to a head. In the Third World, things begin to pick up as Ringabel begins to piece together what appear to be his memories. It begins with him confronting Eri and Kaldisla about everything Alternus said before his two previous demises, mentioning that he has memories of her wings containing a 6, something quite odd now that they seem to contain a 3, along with the memory of Idia being slain by some kind of monster. This naturally upsets Agnes once Eri begins making a fuss, the thought of her fairy companion being anything but honest and true being far too much for her to bear, so Ringabel leaves it at that for then, since he doesn't exactly have any memories to cement his claims. Later, in Heart's Child, Ringabel confides in Tiz that he's fairly certain that he's a version of Alternus that came from a different world entirely, and that he found himself in Tiz's original world after the version of his friends had all perished at the hands of a monster. He doesn't exactly have the pieces yet, but the further you get into the game, the more comes flooding back until he finally has a full picture of what's happening. Eri's wings are a countdown. She's put them through this time and time again, and he's Alternus Dim. But instead of being like the countless other Alternuses he's seen before, he didn't die. Instead, he survived to witness the consequences of his failure. Remember Dee's journal? The entire reason for Tiz and Agnes letting Ringabel come along in the first place? Well, let's look back at that, because now that our blonde has put everything together, it's not hard to realize just what happened to Alternus before he ultimately became the Ringabel we know and love. His origins haven't changed. He was still the orphan left to die in the gutters, who was eventually taken in by Eternian royalty and turned into the Dark Knight to protect and serve his adoptive country. But this time we get to see who this Alternus was from a perspective other than Idia's. Coming to Kaldisla on the Echelot, Alternus found a home there in an attempt to keep an eye on the defensive powers of the nation, since he was stationed there by the Grand Marshal himself. While he was staying there, two things happened. The Great Chasm destroyed all of Nerende, and Edea betrayed all of Eternia by taking up arms with Tiz and Agnes. Remember, this is Alternus, not Ringabel, so our Dark Knight didn't go out there and make friends with them, becoming the fourth warrior of light. No, instead all he could do is vow to take down the Vestal while also protecting Edea, trying to find a way to secure the safety and the love of his beloved, while also succeeding in pleasing his adoptive country and proving his undying loyalty to it. Of course, Alternus doesn't take her betrayal all that well, and his rather poor attempts to get her to understand his feelings only proves to annoy Edea and ultimately drive a wedge between the two of them. He follows them throughout the game, always just a few paces behind, but the journal gets surprisingly humanizing near the end. As he mentions during his stationing in Eisenberg, he is the one who rescues Egil, more or less unofficially adopting him for part of the story, as the kid helps him along and Alternus protects and cares for him. Hell, he cares for him to the point where Egil becomes a priority, and Alternus ends up being horrifically burned to the bone by lava, trying to protect Egil and get to the fire crystal before Edea and her companions. He should be dead. This much is obvious, but thanks to his connections to Kata and Victor, he doesn't die there, instead enduring torturous treatments from Kata before being put in a white magic chamber and basically having to regrow all of his skin. But he did it, because his priorities lay with somebody else. It wasn't about him. It was never about him. It has always been and will always be about Edea. The moment he's rehabilitated and strong enough to leave, he's out the door, with the Grand Marshal confiding in him that Aerie is a monster, attempting to destroy worlds in an attempt to bring about the return of her master, Ouroboros, that she's the true threat and that to save Edea, she must be killed. And so he heads off to do exactly that. But, well, I think you can imagine how well that went, since by this time you've defeated Alternus more than once. But this time, instead of falling off of Grand's ship and to his death, Alternus remains at least conscious, while also being unable to stop what happens next, as the monster that Ringabel recalls killing Edea turns out to be Aerie, and well, she does exactly that, slaying all three warriors of light before setting her sights on Alternus. She doesn't get a chance to kill him, however. Oh no, he survives and is sent into the next world with Aerie, but the trauma coupled with the sudden world hopping leaves him without any recollection of who he was or why he is there. The only thing to his name is Dee's journal, and there he lay until the people of Kaldisla found him and took him in, giving him food, shelter, and a name, Ringabel. For the rest of the game, Ringabel simply isn't the same, neither in how you receive him or how he carries himself. And how could he be? I mean, suddenly he's got not only his own memories, but the memories of an entirely new person, the emotions of an entirely new person, swimming inside him and crying for retribution, crying for forgiveness and repentance. Looking at Edea is no longer just looking at a woman he harbors love for and longs to protect. Now seeing her is staring into the face of the person he's failed, that died because he wasn't strong enough to care for her. Think about Alternus from Edea's original world. Was his proposal something our Alternus also did? Did he also beg for her love, for her understanding and support before she defeated him, before he lost the fight and she was slain? The only person who knows that is Ringabel. And out of all the characters, I'd venture a guess that although everybody is worn out and wishing to be finished, he's the one who is most ready and willing to throw in the towel and be absolutely finished with this adventure. And although they're forced to bide time for a little bit longer, eventually they succeed in giving Aerie what she wants, immediately defeating her before turning their sights on the true boss, Ouroboros. The whole fight is just the biggest pain in the ass, but when it's finally over, you feel more relieved than you knew was possible, because it looks like the suffering is finally over, never to bother you again. But for Ringabel in particular, the ending of the situation isn't as easy as it seems, because while Edea, Tiz, and Agnes all come from the same world and will return to it, Ringabel doesn't come from that world. And with the option to go to whichever world he wishes, our blonde decides to do something that more or less completely broke my heart. Now, depending on the ending you picked, the normal ending or the true ending, Ringabel's story is concluded in one of two ways. If you were impatient, like I was, and had no way of accessing the internet during your first playthrough of the game because you were in the middle of literally nowhere, then you probably broke the crystal. And, well, we can get into that another day because the important part is that while in both games, Ringabel makes the choice to return to his world instead of going to his friend's world with them. In the normal ending, we watch him walk alone through Grandship to the place where his friends were slaughtered, leaving a single rose where they were slain and cupping his hands in prayer. He's all alone, unable to do anything about his circumstance except grieve the loss of the people whom he's failed to protect. The true ending didn't leave me as bitter, however, but it didn't want to appease me either, as Ringabel still chooses to return to his world, but this time his choice is a lot more concrete. He's seen hell. He's not only killed Eri, but he helped his friends kill Ouroboros, so he's capable of doing anything he needs to. So, instead of returning to his world to mourn those he's failed, he returns to protect them, showing up as Alternus to join the fight against monster Eri to prevent them from ever having died to begin with. He's left the Warriors of Light behind to make sure the sense of grief never repeats itself, because he's finally become strong enough to prevent it from ever happening again. But there's a sequel game. Well, okay, so there's a sequel game, and from the outset, I told myself that I would only buy it if Ringabel was a playable character, because the fact that he'd never show up again was too heartbreaking for me to stomach. I wanted him and the Idia I love to get together, to live out their lives in peace and all the other schlock that comes with shipping a set of characters more than the doctor recommends. When the employee at my local game shop gave me the bad news that he was only in a side quest, I swallowed my frustrations, remembered how much I liked the first game, and figured I might as well play it. And although I prefer the original game by a country mile, I still really like Bravely Second, and you really grew on me as a character over time, even though Tiz is still there, so the whole main character thing is super up in the air. But since Alternus' death was retconned for the sequel, our favorite edgelord knight is back, and anytime he dared to show his face, all I could do was question who that was, if he was Alternus Dim or Ringabel trying to return to his old life to stay close to Adia. So of course I read into every line he spoke and every movement he made, hoping that it was my Ringabel and not just plain old Alternus. But we don't get any confirmation of any of this until we finally get to that side quest, and oh boy, when we get to it, you might be a genius like me who completely forgot to actually do the side quest and go back to complete it after finishing the entirety of Bravely Second, even though you bought the game just to see him again. Just, an example happened to a friend. Seriously though, this side quest is really interesting because it's half about world building and making you realize that his family name is pretty shady and that this world is full of ugly things, and Ringabel finally gets to show back up as himself. Naturally, he's all about that dramatic timing since he waits for this quest's antagonist, Yoko, to basically destroy Idia emotionally, calling out our Grand Marshal's emotional turmoil about being the only one who was abandoned by the one she loved. That Tiz and Agnes had each other, you and Magnolia had each other, that everybody had their loved one except for her, and that there was something wrong with her, that she was why he didn't stay. It's only when she weeps, calling his name and asking why he left and where she was, that he finally reveals himself not only to be there, but to truly be the person that Idia needed the most. After getting rightfully pissed at him for not revealing himself right away, Ringabel makes it clear that he would've, if he'd have been given the chance. He reveals to his friends that he's been at their sides throughout the entire journey, but because of what he does for a living now, he was not allowed to tell them that it was him. He could exist near them, but only if they didn't know it was Ringabel at their sides. In fact, the place where the side quest is the only place he could have ever told them who he was, because it technically existed in its own pocket of dimension, somewhere where the Dimensional Bureau couldn't rule over him. Ringabel is now something called a Planeswarden, basically meaning that because he's been somewhat knowingly hopping dimensions and had nowhere to truly exist as himself, he instead is now in a line of work that has him specifically going from dimension to hunt down criminals and solve dimensional breaking conflicts. He spends the quest simply basking in his friend's company, trying to be his typical jovial self, only to find that they cannot really handle that anymore, which leads to this great part where Idia and Tiz simply ask for him to tell them he's back, clearly just relieved to finally see him after so long of presuming that they'd never see him again. Also, just a quick side note, can we talk about the fact that Idia's Bravely Second outfit before you reclass her is literally Ringabel's coat from Game 1? I mean, damn, this couldn't be more adorable if they tried. Move over Tiz and Anya's because you can't beat these two in adorability. Even though by the end of the game it's implied that Tiz and Anya's get married and live in Nerende as farm folk forever, making them way more canon and all that, but hey, who cares? Idia and Ringabel are cute, and that's all that matters. But unfortunately, this is only a side quest, and eventually you beat Yoko, albeit with some pretty funny interruptions from Ringabel. And although he promises that someday he will return to Idia's side, it's nothing more than a promise for now. He'll return to her someday, but for now we really don't know when or where someday is going to be. The future, I suppose, but in a game series like Bravely Default, time literally is just a malleable thing that can be stopped, rewound, or slowed down if somebody needs it to. So who knows when he'll be back? All we really know is that he promises Idia that he will, so all we can do is hope that he keeps his word. Well, we do know a little bit, since Bravely Second has an after credits scene with Ringabel narrating the discovery of the Sword of the Brave and how it's another key needed by the Dimensional Bureau. But until Bravely Third, or Secondly Default as some have been calling it, is actually released, this does conclude Ringabel's story for now, which I find both heartwarming and frustrating. Because on one hand, with where the story ends, Ringabel doesn't get to be with Idia, and I think after the events of Default, it's clear that everything he does is for Idia. It's always been about Idia, and it will always be. She's the love of his life, the person he'd do anything for, and the person he sort of has done everything for, whether he knew it at the time or not. But on the other hand, the Dimensional Bureau in his life as a Planeswarden has given him a place to belong, a place to exist and exist as Ringabel, instead of a version of Alternus Dim who simply cannot be Alternus anymore. I suppose my happy ending for him would be to simply see Ringabel complete this ultimate mission he's working on, to see Bravely Third all about his life in the Dimensional Bureau as he traverses this familiar world one last time before finally returning to Idia and finding a life with her there in Eternia. He could find himself, figure out where and who he wishes to be before finding the love he's yearned for since he was abandoned by his mother, in Idia, being the proud and fashionable husband to the Grand Marshal, and living out the rest of his life there, finally retiring from the world of fighting. Of course, this is nothing more than a little bit of wish fulfillment, but at the end of the day, I don't think anybody would argue with me when it comes to the fact that Ringabel has more than earned his happy ending. That he's been through hell and back, and the fact that he's still able to face the world with a smile on his face and optimism in his eyes cements him as the strongest member of the team, and as my favorite character in all of video games.